Chapter 3 Trouble Begins. Life in the colonies was not always peaceful. For many years, the British, the French, and American Indians fought over land in North America. These battles were called the French and Indian Wars. Parliament comes from the French word parler, meaning to speak. The conflict was long. It cost the British a lot of money. The British Parliament, or government, decided to tax the American colonies. A tax is what people must pay the government. The colonists had no say or representation in Parliament. They could not vote on these new taxes. They thought this was unfair. They complained about taxation without representation. The Stamp Act. In 1765, Britain ordered the colonies to pay a new tax. Everyone had to buy a tax stamp to put on their important papers. Newspapers had to be printed on special stamped paper that cost extra money. There was even a tax on playing cards. Tax on a newspaper cost as much as a British soldier made in a day. Many of the colonists were outraged. Throughout the colonies, men formed groups called the Sons of Liberty. These groups met in secret, and they vowed to fight the Stamp Act. These are some of the stamps required by the Stamp Act. On the day the tax took effect, shops were closed. Church bells rang. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a coffin with the word liberty on it was carried through the streets. Liberty comes from the Latin word libre, which means free. The colonists even protested with teapots. Some colonists refused to pay the tax or buy stamps. They ran tax collectors out of town. Stamp Act riots broke out in the big cities. In Boston, men burned the Stamp Act office. The British decided to end the Stamp Act. Patriot comes from the ancient Greek word patriotes, which means fatherland. But many colonists were still angry. Some began calling themselves patriots. Patriots are people who love their country enough to fight for it. Other colonists remained loyal to Britain. They called themselves loyalists. The Boston Massacre. The British sent an extra 4,000 troops into Boston. The colonists in Boston did not want the soldiers in their city. A massacre is the killing of a group of people. In 1770, a mob gathered around a British soldier, standing guard in front of a customs house. They began to throw snowballs filled with rocks. Other British troops rushed out to rescue him. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Fire!" It was never known who yelled the order to fire. Patriot Paul Revere created this engraving of the Boston Massacre. The British were under orders not to shoot, but they panicked. They began shooting into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed. The colonists called this the Boston Massacre. The Boston Tea Party. Many colonists liked to drink tea. When the British placed a new tax on tea, the colonists were very angry. In November of 1773, 3 British ships sailed into Boston Harbor. They were loaded with tea. Coffee became popular when the colonists gave up tea. On December 16th, a large crowd gathered at the Old South Church in Boston. They met to protest the tax. When it was dark, some men painted their faces like Mohawk Indians. They didn't want anyone to know who they were. The men headed down to the harbor. Quickly, they slipped into rowboats and rowed out to the ships. Then they leapt aboard and dumped tons of tea into the harbor. The tea they dumped would be worth about $90,000 today. The British were furious with them. King George III ordered Boston Harbor closed. He put tighter controls over the colonists, and in June 1774, more British troops were then sent to Boston. Men used tomahawks to break open containers of tea. Liberty trees and boycotts. Other colonies heard what was happening up in Boston. They sent food and money to help. They boycotted British goods. Boycott means to stop buying products or doing business with someone. The colonists also flew liberty flags from trees. They called them liberty trees. British soldiers often cut down the trees. When they did, colonists put up liberty poles instead. Loyalists still wanted to live peacefully with Britain, but some patriots wanted to free themselves of British rule forever. You've got mail. There were no telephones, TVs, or radios in the colonies. It could take months to get mail. Newspapers. By 1775, there were around 100 newspapers in the colonies. Some came out weekly, while others were printed every day. Town crier. Many towns had a town crier. He walked through the streets ringing a bell. He called out the time as well as the news of the day. Letters. Letters were sealed with hot wax. Colonial houses had no numbers. An address often described where a person lived. It might say, big white house next to blacksmith shop. Post riders. Post riders delivered the mail on horseback. Sometimes their only roads were Indian trails. They often left letters at taverns or shops. Stagecoaches and wagons also carried mail.